The final piece of code that we're going to write for this project is the BlockExtractor utility class that is meant for this declaration here. So in this video, we're going to complete that class. Alright, so now let's just add another class. Right click on your project and select on Add Class. And let us call this as BlockExtractor util. There you go. So before we can start coding, we need to import all those AutoCAD APIs, .NET APIs. So imports autodesk.autocad application services. Let me just copy this over. So the second one is the database services. The third one is the runtime and the editor input. Let's also import the system.io because we will be needing some of the functionalities here for creating a file to be storing all those block attributes. Alright, so now let's create a method that is defined in this declaration here, the process block extraction, with 3 parameters: the drawing file, the block name, and the file name. So public sub process block extraction. You will have the first argument is the DWG file. Oops. As a string. Next, the block name. Block name as a string. And the third one is the file name as a string. Okay, so now if we go back to our form code behind, if we uncomment this line of code here, it's no longer giving us error. And so with this one here, because we have already created the method, the class, and the method. So right click and go to definition. It will bring us to this method. Okay, so now that we have all of these parameters that we need for our code, we can start with creating the document object, which is equal to the application.document manager, and we are going to open that particular drawing file. Okay, and then we have to make sure that we lock the document. This is to avoid the e-lock violation error. And now we can get the DB as database. That will be equal to the document object.database, and then edt as editor. That will be equal to doc.editor. Let's just put this one here. So we group together all the declarations. Excuse me. And now we can message the user. Let's say VB line feed and selecting all the block name in the drawing. So we're just concatenating this message here with the block name that's being passed to the method. And now we can start our transaction. So using, let's call that as using trans as transaction equals db dot transaction manager that start transaction. And now we can retrieve the block table. So dim block table, or bt, as block table equals, we will cast it to the block table. We use the try cast, and then from the transaction object we get the get object, and from the database object we get the block table ID and the open mode for read, and cast it to block table. Okay, next let's just check if not block table that has block name. So we are searching from the block table if there is no block name in that table. So if there's no block, all we have to do is just message the user saying that no no block name found in the drawing. Okay, and then just return. No further processing needed. Otherwise, we will create our filter based on the type value. So dim type value, or TV, as type value equals new type value. We'll put an index of 1, which means that we have two filter criteria. Starts with 0 and 1, and initialize it to a blank array first. Now we have to set value for the type value. Set value new type value and then we will cast that to integer, the DXF code. So the start would be insert, which is meant for the block, and then that will be our index 0. Next, let's just copy this over, and the DXF code here would be the block name, and that will be the actual block name that is being passed from our argument here, and that index would be 1. So we are selecting the type of insert with the block name of this block name here. Next, we need to create a filter as selection filter, this one here, equals new selection filter. That requires a type value, which we have defined here as TV. And now we can create a prompt selection result variable. So dim prompt selection result as prompt selection result equals edt.select all, and we pass the filter. Okay, so now that we have that filter, we are going to validate that if the PSR, or the prompt selection result status, equals prompt status dot OK. If it's OK, then we can now create a selection set to store those values. So dim ss as selection set equals psr.value. And now we can create a few more variables for our attributes. So the first one is dim attr val. This is the attribute value as a string. Let's just initialize it to empty string first. And now also we define a variable for the header as a string, also initialized to a empty string. And next we need to have the writer object, or the stream writer, equals new stream writer and the file name. Okay, this one here. So we are just creating a stream writer where we have to write all the information or the data. Next, we will create another variable for the selected object in the selection set. Selected object equals ss0. So in this one here, we are just getting the first object from the selection set, ss. This for our creation of the header. And now we are going to create another variable for the block reference. So let's just call that as bref, as block reference, and cast it to try cast from the transaction object. That get object cell obj, this is the one here that we created, dot object id, and this time is the open mode that will be for write, and cast it to block reference. Next, we are going to check if there is an attribute, or there is a collection of attributes that is greater than 0. So if block reference that attribute collection that count is greater than 0, then we can now start creating our header. So header equals to, let's start with the insertion point x, comma, insertion point y, and comma, and then the rest of the attribute tag names will be appended in this header. So we are going to loop through the attribute collection. So for each, call that attribute reference ID as object ID in the block reference that attribute collection. We will create an object as database object. So dim obj as db object, equals trans.get object, and that will be the object ID will be the at reference ID and open mode for read. Next, we will now create a variable to store the attribute reference. So dim, let's call that as @ref, as attribute reference equals, we'll do also a try cast object, the obj, this one, cast it to attribute reference. And we can just validate one more time. If @ref is not nothing, then we can append to the header plus equals @ref dot the tag. Okay, and also another comma for the next attribute. So basically in this code here, we are just looping through all the attribute tags, and then we are just appending it to the header, which we started as insertion point X and point Y, then whatever attribute tags definitions we have in the block, then we will just keep appending it to the header. Okay, so next, once we are done looping through the attributes tags, we can now write into our stream writer. So writer dot write line header dot sub string is from 0. We're just basically removing the last comma here in our header. So header dot length -1. Okay, so we have all the completed header, and then we just, for this line, we just get rid of the last comma. Next, we are now ready to write the actual value. So we'll do the same thing. We'll do the same for the for each. So for each obj as selected object in selection set, we can now get another reference for the block. So dim br as block reference equals try cast. So from the transaction that get object, our obj, the selected object, that is our object ID, then open mode dot for write and cast it to block reference. Next, we are going to check if br, the block reference, that attribute collection that count is greater than 0, then we will now format the value of the attributes. attr val plus or equals br dot position dot x, that will be the x coordinate, to string, and also we will concatenate the br dot position dot y, the y coordinate, that to string. Okay, so now we have the x and y here. Then we will do the same thing for the rest of the attributes. So for each at reference ID as object ID in br.attribute collection. Let's declare another object here, obj as db object equals trans.getObject. The object ID is the attribute reference ID at reference ID open mode for read. This now we are reading now the values of the attributes, and now I mean for the object. So now we declare the attribute reference and cast it to the obj to attribute reference. So if the attribute reference is not nothing, then it means it has a value. So attr val plus equals at ref the text string. So now we're getting the values of each attribute, and also append a comma at the end. So once we're done with all the values, we have now completed the attr val format. So we can write it also in our writer. So instead of header, we are going to write the attr val here, and then attr val -1, attr val dot length -1, and that's it. So basically we loop through one of the object first, get all the attribute tags, and then we've created the header. And for this block of code, all we've done is get the x and y, and then we loop through the attribute and also append or concatenate all those attribute values. So now we're good. So next we have to make sure that we have to reset the value of attr val equals empty string. Otherwise it will keep on appending to this variable here. So once we are done with the first block, we write it and we reset the val and loop to the next block again. And now we are done with that. All we have to do is send a message to the user. Okay, number of block name found is ss ss.count that to string, a selection set, and then we can close the string, I mean the writer. So make sure to close the writer, don't forget that. All right, so that is if there is a object selected. Otherwise we'll also handle the else here. Else edt that write message. We just say that there is no block found. And now that we have processed and went through all the objects, all we have to do now is discard or close the drawing. Close and discard. We're not saving anything because all we've done is retrieve the blocks in the drawing. And that's it for our method. But there is one more method that we have to add here, and that is our runtime method call, or the name of the method that we're going to write or invoke in the AutoCAD command. Let's just call this method as public sub extract blocks, and in here we are going to instantiate the form, and we will show it to the user. So dim, let's just call it as form as block extractor form equals new block extractor form, and then form that show. There you go. So we need to create the command method, and let's just call this as just EB, simple one, extract blocks. And that completes our block extractor utility class. Let's save our code, and we should be ready to test our plugin, and that will be our next task in the next video. So I'll see you there.